about your influences. You started with Joe Satriani, Vinnie Moore, and who was the other ones?
There was like Paul Gilbert. This is where in my shreddier years, you know, being a young dude and trying to play as many notes as you can.
Yeah.
But coming from the Shadows thing, I still had that melodic thing.
Yeah.
All that whole melodic thing happening. I always strive for the melodic thing. And I remember when I went, just getting away from that for a little bit, going to lessons for the first time, and my teacher was trying to teach me improvisation.
Yeah.
And as I said, I was into the Shadows, and he was teaching me like a pentatonic scale, playing over the blues.
Yeah.
And he'd be playing like a blues progression, and he'd say to me, "Look, this is what you got to play, these dots here." And so I'd just play through it, and I'd be thinking, "Why doesn't this sound right? It sounds weird.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound melodic." So, but then I left it, and years later I sort of picked up on it again and thought, "Wow, actually this is pretty cool." And then getting into Satriani and stuff like that, and listening to those players. But then later on, I sort of, as you do, you get older and your taste changes. I started getting into jazz a lot, and I took some lessons from another brilliant teacher who opened up my whole, you know, way of looking at the way it should be sort of, you know, soloing over changes, and a different way of looking across the fretboard. His name's Clemens, still doing gigs around town, a brilliant player. Anyone that knows him in Sydney would know, you know exactly what I'm talking about. He's amazing. And at the time, when Joe Satriani came out, he was doing that whole Joe Satriani, like it just came out, and he was doing it. Wow. And he was doing clinics for Ibanez. He was endorsed by Ibanez Guitars at the time, and I'd always go and watch him play, and it just inspired me, you know. And then years later, I got lessons off him, and it really, you know, I'm so thankful for that. You know, I probably had about 7 or 8 lessons off him, and it was just the best thing I could have ever done.
Yeah.
Because it definitely shaped my playing to the way I'm playing today. If it wasn't for that, I'd probably still be playing whatever.
Yeah.
And with that attitude of, this is good enough, you know, I can solo type thing.
And it's actually funny because I've noticed, especially like you said, your taste changed. I've been going more into jazz and fusion. And like looking at some of the guys like, you know, Dizzy Gillespie, like all the brass players, they all had mentors at some point in their life.
That's right.
Where they went and they studied under someone.
Yes.
And they took whatever they could from them.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly.
That was definitely a point for me. There's nothing more inspiring than sitting in a room with someone you respect and want to be like. You know, that's all. I just wanted to play like Dieter. You know, for me it was always about, wow, listen to him play, and the way he'd improvise over the tracks, it'd be just like, whoa. Yeah. You know, I'd go home, you know, depressed for one, which is a good thing. Yeah. Because it just made me strive. Because I thought, you know what, I'm going to go home, I'm going to practice this. You know, I'm going to get back and I'm going to show him that I'm improving. You know, that's all I wanted. I just wanted to show him that I was taking something from him. You know, and it wasn't a waste of time. So it was definitely a turning point for me. That's fantastic. In my playing. And then he introduced me to, you know, guys like, you know, especially the fusion. He sort of plays the Frank Gambale's and all those type of players. Scott Henderson. You know, at the time I was, that sort of got me across the line with crossing. There was another great guitar player who here in Australia, Brett Garsed.
Fantastic player.
Yeah, like still to this day I hear him play, and it's just like mind-blowing stuff. You know, and even listening to the stuff he was doing back then, I hear it now. I still get blown away, and if I had to nut it down to 2 players that was the biggest influence, it would be Brett Garsed and Dieter. I didn't have that, obviously the whole thing of, hey Brett, can I have a lesson of you, sort of thing. You know, it was never like that, because you know, he was in Melbourne, he was touring with John Farnham at the time, and even though that was my dream to one day meet him, you know, which sort of has become a reality for me. You know, just hanging out with him and just having a chat like this. We were here just probably a few months back, just in this very room. He was just here sort of playing, and for me, like, he doesn't know this, but now you got to know this, Brett. But he was just sitting here just playing.
Yeah.
And for me to be sitting there, like all that was going through my head was like, I can't believe I'm sitting here. You know, a child, you know, the kid sort of growing up watching him play.
That's right.
You know, and dreaming that one day he'd be sitting, you know, in front of me, sort of playing and talking like that. So that he was a massive, massive influence. You know, and you know, it's really evident in my playing, especially in the legato thing. You know, it's really obvious that he's one guy that I really studied hard and wanted to be like, you know. And as you do, you know, you sort of put your own spin on it, but, you know, I could never play, you know, the way he does.
Did you go through the hybrid picking phase?
Oh, look, I didn't even know what he was doing then, because back in those days, you know, all I had was, you know, the John Farnham live Whispering Jack tour video, which I warned out to death, you know. But every time there's a part that I always wanted to see, they'd always focus on something else. I'd be like, they'd be focusing on his face instead of it's like, no, down on the fingers. So I never knew what he was doing. I just tried to do what he was doing. I don't know what, you know, it was trial and error, and it never sounded like him. But then, you know, because we didn't have the luxury of YouTube and, you know, and tablature, you know, no one was transcribing his solos back then, you know, and we didn't have that until, you know, probably late 90s, you know, where things were starting to come out. He released his first instructional video, and when I saw it and saw what he was doing, like I was blown, thinking, what the, you know, this is totally different to what I thought, you know, it was. And then having that video, really, I was like, whoa. And it was, at that point, it was a bit late for me to sort of, oh, well, you know what, I'm going to actually do it like with the way, it was just way too late. You know, so even though it's only of late that I've started sort of using the hybrid thing, but I don't use it to its full potential, you know, the way a lot of guys are using it out there, the way Brett uses it as well. I just sort of, a lot of the notes that I play and the way I sort of approach that technique is where I hammer onto the next string, you know, like a hammer from nowhere. So just sort of, I do that sort of thing. Oh, does he do that? Right, okay, guys like Greg Howe as well, you know. I never sort of got into, I loved his playing. I had all his albums actually up until that point. But I was never, once again, I didn't know what he was doing, because it was just so, it was like liquid.
That's right,
you know, and I was just thinking, what is he doing? So it was too hard to comprehend, where Brett was more, he was sort of playing the pop thing, you know, in the band, you know, the hired gun, and doing these unbelievable solos. They were melodic, it had everything you wanted in a solo. So that's what drew me to that. It was the melodic context, the technique, the way he would approach it, and it's just, that's what I want to be. That's exactly what I want to be. So that was a massive thing. Massive influence, you know, and those two guys for me. And then, you know, listening to Scott Henderson and stuff like that brought a lot of the sort of bluesy concepts into play, and that really changed my view of things as well. So, but then you sort of go through the jazz phase, and then you sort of go back to your roots, you know, and you sort of start listening to metal again, and then, you know, and then you sort of just wander off, and you end up creating this style. And growing up in my, you know, with mum and dad, and, you know, my family, they, dad was listening to a lot of country music, and a lot of, you know, Johnny Cash, Willie Nelson, Dolly Parton, all that old school sort of stuff, you know, and I was always drawn to it because it was melodic and the whole thing, but I never played it, ever.
You know? It was always in the back there somewhere.
It was always sort of just sitting there. So after all these years, you know, it's just sort of coming out naturally, you know, not sort of forcing the issue. If you put me in a country band and, you know, play country, I'll be like, what? Well, what? You know, what's going on here? So it's just something that comes out, and I feel that, you know, all the styles that I've had over the years and been into, you know, it's sort of coming out in my playing, you know, naturally. And I'm all about the natural thing, you know, just making it sort of come out, you know, whichever way.
I guess with improvisation, you know, it is all about that too. That's the whole thing.